Howdy. This is the ABCs of cognitive work. And on the surface of things, the ABCs of working with our thoughts seem pretty simple. However, it can actually be very powerful for us to become more aware of the thoughts that are moving through our heads. And as we start to unpack those thoughts and examine them, we start to see the different types of judgments, assumptions, expectations, or just variety of beliefs that can influence our emotional state. This video will be about the ABCs of examining how thoughts impact emotions and is largely based upon the work of Albert Ellis's rational emotive therapy, which also became rational emotive behavioral therapy. ABCs are essentially a process that starts with an activating event, that's what the A stands for, to which our mind has some sort of assessment, some sort of belief, B, and then we have some sort of emotional reaction to that, or consequence, C, so A, B, C. I'm going to talk about each of these in turn and provide an example so we can see how they connect to each other. As I mentioned, the A is the activating event. This is when something happens in our lives, or when we're presented with some form of stimulus. That stimulus then activates a belief, thereby triggering an emotional response inside of us. You know, most things in our environment create some sort of reaction. And if we slow down to think about it, we can start to unpack that reaction. Now let's look at a simple example that will kind of pull through the ABCs. Let's say a friend calls us on our birthday, and that creates a response. So we've got this activating event. And most commonly what we experience is a consequence that follows right after. In other words, something happens and we have an emotional response. This friend calls us on our birthday and we feel happy. Now what's happening between A and C, the activating event and the consequence, is a B belief. Now the B belief happens very quickly. And so most frequently we say, well, this person called and I felt this way. But really it's this person called, I believe this about the call, therefore I feel this way. And so we can examine what causes this or triggers this happy feeling. What do I believe about this situation? Now this is a bit of a sidebar, but notice that I asked a what question instead of a why question. Asking why questions often lead us down a different sort of path, one that is a bit more existential in nature. And while that can be great, it really doesn't serve us well all the time. So using what questions typically calls us to think more concretely about the situation. For example, what is causing this happy feeling? This helps me orient towards the evidence in contrast to why am I happy, which can go into a number of different directions. So what causes this consequence of a happy feeling? It's not necessarily the activating event, the friend calling on the birthday, but instead is the belief that I have about that event. Our minds have a reaction to things. They essentially contextualize the stimulus that's come in. Some people refer to this as kind of a narrative, that we have a story about what's happening. We need to understand that story. Regardless, this thought can happen so fast in a pre-conscious way that it almost seems instantaneous. And oftentimes these thoughts are referred to as automatic thoughts, which comes from Aaron Beck's work in cognitive therapy. So going back to that example, friend calls on my birthday, I feel happy, activating event and consequence. Therefore, the belief that mediates this relationship between activating event and consequence becomes important. And I might look at that belief and say maybe it's something like, I'm cared for. I believe I am cared for. So this all starts to fall into place. A, the activating event, a friend calls. B, the belief. We believe that we are cared for. And then C, the consequence, we feel happy. Maybe we feel loved. And that's wonderful. And we hopefully can see how it all fits together. So too, if I adjust this a little bit, we can start to see how this shifts. So if the consequence to that phone call were feeling sad instead of happy, that would suggest that a different belief emerged in response to that phone call. So activating event, friend calls, consequence, I feel sad. So what's the belief? What's causing that? And so we might look further into that to understand what we're telling ourselves about that event. Maybe belief that starts to emerge is something like, people feel sorry for me. So we might be thinking the only reason that they're calling on my birthday is because they feel sorry for me. And as I start to hold that, I start to feel a little sad just thinking about it. But regardless, we have the same equation with different variables, and so therefore a different result. Someone calls on our birthday, we believe that they're only calling because they feel sorry for us, and so we feel sad because we're unloved in some way. And I hope you see how some of that linear process occurs, that essentially the B shapes our response to an event, and so it connects logically. Again, A, B, C. So this brings up an important question. What can we do about these thoughts if they are upsetting like this? If I'm thinking that people feel bad for me, and so I'm feeling sad, then I need to do something about that. And that's where the D of the ABC model comes into play, which stands for disputation. That essentially we can notice these beliefs, acknowledge them, and then start to dispute them. To kind of ask, well, what's the evidence for this? How do I know that this is true? The old adage of just because we think it doesn't make it true applies in this situation. In other words, just because we have this belief doesn't necessarily make it an accurate or true belief. We can start to examine what's the accuracy or truthfulness of this statement or beliefs that have emerged. This opens up a process of trying to come to a more concrete or more accurate view of that activating event. Now, I'll address disputation in more detail elsewhere, but for now, just identifying these beliefs can help deepen our awareness of what's going on inside of our minds. This process of the ABCs of cognitive work is a helpful framework to use in starting to explore what thoughts, beliefs, assumptions are coming up in our day-to-day lives. I often encourage people to start noticing their responses. In other words, their emotions. Notice what events are occurring that they're in response to, and then see if they can start to identify that mediating belief. Looking at what belief is there that they're saying about themselves, about the world, about the future, or even about the past. And these may be informing their emotional responses. And if we can start to pull those out more, it gives us material to work with. It gives us something to do. And this makes me think about total behavior, which I talk about in another video, and driving that metaphorical car. And that we can't just change our feelings or our emotional response. We can't just change our physiology, those back wheels. But we need to instead steer with the wheels that we have control over, our thinking and our doing. So essentially our thoughts and our behaviors. We can control those and we can shift and drive in different directions. And so pulling out these thoughts in the ABC model gives us an ability to steer a little bit more effectively, particularly when it comes to those thought wheels. So I encourage people to write out ABC and identify what happened, how am I feeling about it, and what thought or belief is creating this reaction. And it seems simple, but as we get into it, it can actually be quite complex and challenging because sometimes we'll mistake a feeling or an emotional response for a thought. Even the example about getting the birthday phone call, we might say something like, I feel like people don't like me. Well, that's a thought. That's not a feeling. The thought is, people don't like me. The feeling is maybe sadness or feeling isolated or abandoned. Make sure that we identify both a thought and a feeling in order to start working with that relationship between the two. And once we get that thought, we can start to work with it. What's the evidence? Is there another way to look at it? If we continue to believe this, where will that get us? Is that the worst case scenario? And if it is the worst case scenario, are we able to deal with it? Things like that. But I hope you continue to explore your thoughts and what they bring up for you. And that this is a first step towards pulling out and working with those materials that come up just in day-to-day living. Thanks.